The year is 1488. From the highest point of the Château de Nantes Tower, a 12-year-old girl stands motionless, her small fingers clutching the cold edge of the stone window. Her knuckles are already white, but she doesn't loosen her grip. Outside, the world is in flames. Brittany's fields, once so green and ancient, are now stained with the smoke of distant villages, black columns rising like silent screams into the gray sky. On the horizon, enemy banners move in slow, relentless waves, blood-red flags flapping in the wind, like the wings of vultures circling something dying. She smells the soot. She also hears the low thunder of approaching hooves, the metallic rhythm of iron against iron, the scattered cries of a people being crushed under the boots of history. Her name is Anne, and she doesn't cry. She presses her forehead against a thick, icy glass and watches the end of her childhood, not with a whimper, but to the sound of war drums. The great Duchy of Brittany, once free and proud, now suffocates under siege, and she, little more than a child, is its sole heir. Days ago, her father, Duke Francis II, drew his last breath in this very castle. With his death, the weight of a nation fell onto the narrow shoulders of a girl too young to understand what she had inherited, but old enough to feel the crushing burden. This is not how queens are made. This is how pawns are moved across the board, how daughters become bargaining chips, how girls are dressed in silk and sacrificed on altars built with treaties and ambition. To understand Anne's tragedy, one must first understand what Brittany was and what it meant to lose it. Brittany was not merely a corner of France waiting to be absorbed. It was an ancient land, older in spirit than the crown that sought to claim it. There, the air still vibrated with the breath of Celtic ancestors. The Breton language, sweet and harsh like sea salt on a fisherman's tongue, lingered in every prayer and lullaby. Oak groves whispered the names of forgotten gods. Stone churches stood as signs of silent defiance, their bells ringing not for kings, but for ties of blood. For centuries, the Dukes of Brittany ruled with a fierce sense of identity, balancing diplomacy with stubborn independence. As kingdoms rose and fell, as France fought its endless wars, Brittany stood firm, proud, separate, unconquered. But in 1488, the ducal line fractured. Duke Francis II died without leaving a son. Only 2 daughters remained. Anne, the elder, became Duchess not by ambition, but by lack of choice. And in a world where women were rarely seen as rulers and often used as ransom, this inheritance was as dangerous as it was sacred. She was 12 years old, and suddenly every royal court in Europe turned its eyes on her like wolves scenting a wound. To some, she was a prize, to others a problem, to all a pawn. The French crown had long coveted Brittany. King Charles VIII, only slightly older than Anne, now saw a perfect excuse to seize it, not through war, but through a bridal crown. Meanwhile, beyond the Alps, the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, saw a chance to curb French expansion and extend Habsburg influence through a girl he had never met. Anne, still grieving her father's death, likely didn't even know her name was already being penned into marriage contracts before her mourning clothes were dry. She would only later understand how political war was often waged not with swords, but with veils and alliances. At 13, she made her first act of rebellion, or perhaps of survival. In a quiet, secret ceremony, she married Maximilian by proxy. The emperor was not present. A stand-in spoke the vows. The alliance was designed to protect Brittany with the vast armor of the Holy Roman Empire. But promises made to girls in castles are fragile things, especially when the world belongs to men. The French court declared the marriage invalid, treason even. Charles VIII, impatient, unleashed his armies upon Brittany. The advance was swift, brutal, and merciless. Fortresses fell, supply lines were severed, The very land seemed to mourn. At 15, Anne found herself high on the ramparts of Rennes, watching the horizon fill with banners she could not stop. Her advisors whispered strategies behind her, but deep down she must have known Brittany could not win. Her marriage to Maximilian, brave, desperate, was paper thrown to fire. No one was coming to save her, not the emperor, not the church, not her own gods. Winter came. The siege dragged on. Food ran out. Hope cracked like frost on stone. And then, at last, came the terms. Anne would be spared, but only if she accepted a second marriage, this time not by proxy, not in secret, and not with an ally, with Charles himself, the very king whose banners choked her fields, whose hungry cannons ravaged her people, now demanded her hand. It was not a union. It was a surrender disguised in silk and hymns. On December 6, 1491, Langers Cathedral gleamed with gold and triumph. Its stone walls bore witness not to a wedding, but to a conquest. Anne of Brittany, not yet 16, stood beneath the vaulted arches, her trembling hands given into Charles of Wethives. He was 21. She was his trophy. The golden fabric that draped her shoulders did not hide the truth. This was not love. It was submission. The contract was cruel in its precision. Anne had to renounce her marriage to Maximilian. She had to marry Charles, and if he died before her, she would be legally bound to marry his successor. Her body, her womb, her future, they were now royal property. Not even death could free her. The wedding night was a ceremony of domination. Beneath tapestries depicting French conquests, Anne was led to a chamber more like a battlefield than a marriage bed. The consummation, a public affair behind closed doors, left the sheet stained with blood as proof. Proof of purity, proof of possession. She wept, not like a bride, but like a prisoner who realized her cell had just been locked. But in that moment of profound humiliation, something hardened within her. She learned the art of survival. Pregnancy came quickly. It was necessary. France needed an heir, and Anne was now the vessel. The court watched her belly like a ticking clock, impatient for a boy who would anchor Brittany to the crown. Anne, for her part, carried her grief in silence. Her first pregnancy ended in stillbirth. A perfectly formed son who never breathed. There was no time for mourning. Whispers began immediately. Was she cursed? Was God punishing France through her? Charles showed no grief, only calculation. He wanted to know when she would be ready again. The child's body wasn't even cold. Anne was pregnant again within months. This time, she followed every medical advice, every omen. She wore protective amulets, murmured prayers, ate bitter herbs that promised to guarantee male children. She gave birth. The child lived 3 days and died in her arms. Thus began the cycle that would define her life. Pregnancy, hope, loss, miscarriage, guilt, silence. The court's affection curdled into suspicion. Anne learned to smile in public and bleed in private. She trained herself to expect loss. It was the only way to keep breathing. While Anne drowned in the cruel sea of motherhood, Charles became obsessed with dreams of foreign conquest. Naples, Italy, the warm glory of imperial crowns, these things consumed him. He drained the royal treasury, ignored administration, and disappeared for months on reckless military adventures. In his absence, Anne took power, not formally but in practice. She met with ministers, wrote decrees, negotiated diplomacy. Her rule was quiet, careful, and far more effective than Charles's. She had been forced to marry her enemy. Now she ruled his kingdom. In 1498, fate intervened. Charles, ever careless, hit his head on a low doorframe and collapsed. Within hours, he was dead. No surviving children, no goodbyes. Anne was free, or so it seemed. Freedom? for a queen, was a lie written in ink. According to her marriage contract, Anne now belonged to Charles's successor, Louis XIV, but Louis already had a wife, Joan of France, a devout and disabled woman who had served her husband faithfully for 20 years. It didn't matter. Louis petitioned the Pope for an annulment, claiming the marriage had never been consummated. Church lawyers debated Joan's body in public as if it were a legal artifact. She was humiliated, discarded, and sent to a convent. Anne watched in horror. That could have been her, but she was no longer the same girl who had been in Langeais. When Louis came to claim her, she didn't tremble. She negotiated. She demanded that Brittany retain its political autonomy, that she have a voice in her children's future. Most importantly, she extracted a promise. If Louis died before her, she would not be forced to remarry. Against all odds, she won. The second marriage took place in 1499. This time, Anne walked to the altar not as a captive, but as a political partner. She had lost battles, lost children, but she had learned to dictate the terms. Louis proved to be a better husband than Charles, calculating, but not cruel. He recognized Anne's worth and gave her space to govern. The marriage, though still built on necessity, developed into a strange form of cooperation. Anne established a court that blended French grandeur with Breton tradition. She became a patron of the arts, of education, of women's welfare. In private, she wove discreet alliances with queens and nobles across Europe, creating a network of female resilience in a world ruled by men. But the ghost of lost children still haunted her. Pregnancy after pregnancy, some ended in silence. Others brought joy only to snatch it away days later. The court stopped celebrating too soon. Anne stopped hoping out loud. Then came Claude. In 1501, after years of grief, Anne gave birth to a daughter who lived. Claude became the light in her mother's weary world. But even this joy was poisoned by politics. Claude was not a son. France still lacked an heir. Anne was still failing. But she would not let her daughter follow the same path. She personally oversaw Claude's education, teaching not just embroidery and etiquette, but strategy, law, resilience. Claude would be prepared for thrones, for contracts, for survival. Anne would see to it. By 1513, Anne was dying. Her body, exhausted by 14 pregnancies and decades of grief, was giving way. Louis, now 52, was already arranging a new marriage after her death, to secure the crown, to undo her legacy. Anne acted quickly. She arranged Claude's marriage to Francis of Angoulême, heir to the throne. This union would preserve Brittany within the royal line, on Anne's terms. If she couldn't produce a son, she would make her daughter a mother of kings. It was her final, brilliant move, and it cost her her last strength. In January 1514, Anne died at just 36. Her last words were said to be a prayer for Brittany. She had married 3 times, borne 14 children, buried most of them. She had sacrificed her homeland, but only on the surface. Beneath the layers of conquest and crowns, she had preserved its spirit. She became queen not by birth, not by right, but by resistance. We often imagine queens as women draped in velvet, sweeping through gilded halls, every word echoing among servants. But what does it truly mean to wear a crown when your choices are ripped from you? What does it mean to rule when your body becomes the battlefield upon which empires rise and fall? Anne of Brittany was crowned 3 times, and none of them were by her will. She was born into a world where girls were trained to be valuable only insofar as they could be given away, where a womb mattered more than a voice, where a marriage contract could silence even the strongest will. But Anne was not silenced. She resisted, and in her quiet refusal she found a kind of power the men around her never understood. She never led armies, never sat on the throne of France in her own name. But she navigated a labyrinth of politics, loss, and betrayal with a strength that cannot be measured by military victories or royal proclamations. Her legacy was not forged in battles won, but in battles survived. Think of how many women throughout history, across diverse cultures, have been Anne. Traded, broken, forgotten, but also shrewd, patient, unyielding. Perhaps you, watching this now, recognize a bit of that quiet strength. Perhaps you carry your own weight, invisible to others, but heavy every day. Anne reminds us that dignity does not require freedom, that resistance can be as subtle as a negotiation, that to survive, in the face of a world designed to erase you, is an act of rebellion. And sometimes, the crown that matters most is the one we build within ourselves. Anne of Brittany died on a cold January morning in 1514. She was just 36. The woman who had survived 3 marriages, 14 pregnancies, and countless betrayals now lay silent in the Château de Blois, far from the tower in Nantes, where her story began. Her body was carried through the roads of Brittany. And at her passing, the peasants knelt in silence. They did not see a queen who had married their conquerors. They saw a daughter who had tried to save them. Because Anne never stopped being Breton. Even when her crown displayed the lilies of France, even when her bridal bed was foreign soil, even when her tongue was forced to speak the language of kings, her soul never abandoned the land of her ancestors. Through her, Brittany breathed, quietly, defiantly, in the subtext of royal decrees. Her daughter Claude would marry Francis Feather and become Queen of France. But her path was softer. She entered that marriage by agreement, not by surrender. Thanks to Anne's negotiations, thanks to her sacrifices, Claude was the first of a new line of royal women who would be allowed, even in small ways, to choose. This might be Anne's deepest legacy. She could never say no, but she found ways to say not yet, not like that, never again. She turned forced marriages into leverage. She converted grief into political strategy. And when her own body failed to produce the heir France demanded, she produced a future. Anne never led a revolution. She didn't change the laws of Europe, but she changed the life of one girl, her daughter. And sometimes, that's how history restarts. Not with the sound of trumpets, but with a door left ajar. She preserved Brittany's identity not through armies, but with art, education, and culture. The songs sung in Breton, the stories passed from mother to daughter, the silent rituals of a people under threat. They survived because Anne created space for them in a court that wanted to forget them. And perhaps that is the true meaning of greatness, not to seize power, but to protect memory, not to command history, but to carry it forward. Even if that burden crushes you. Anne's story is not a tragedy, it is a testament. A reminder that surviving is not weakness, that holding grace in the face of coercion is strength, that the sharpest rebellions are sometimes whispered, not shouted. The wind still blows through the towers of Nantes. If you stand there long enough, perhaps you'll feel it, cold and tasting of the sea, carrying the scent of the earth and the waves. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you'll hear her. The voice of a girl, no longer trembling, promising that some things, love, memory, defiance, will outlast even empires.